A very brief introduction to our question this morning. Interviews with people across the world. Is there a God? That's the question we're tackling. Second week in the 7-week series we're in, Explore God, along with close to 1,000 other churches in the Chicagoland area. Now, last week we looked at the question, does life have purpose of any sort? And we kind of ended on the notion that, well, if we're immortal, that is, if God of some sort, whatever God it is, if some sort of something out there exists, then yes, we could have purpose. And if not, then no, we really don't. At best, our lives would have relative meaning. So we might say, well, yeah, God doesn't exist, but I'm going to pour myself in other people. I'm going to live for other people. Okay, here's what I mean by relative meaning. All those people are going to die. You're going to die. All the people who ever knew them are going to die. Eventually, their influence in the world isn't going to be felt anymore. The sun's going to burn out. It's all going to end up in oblivion. And so it didn't matter. It didn't, in the end of the day, matter. So that's one possibility. So either God exists and our lives have purpose, God does not exist, we do not have purpose. That was going to drive us pretty quickly to that second question. So does God exist or not? I feel like I need to know this question. Now, is there a God? Now, we might ask, which God? Can we know him? Sure. Those are questions we'll get to later. Let's proceed by steps. I got more than enough to cover this morning. All right. Is there a supernatural, and we'll call that God for shorthand this morning? Well, you begin to see, of course, why some people see religion as a crutch for the weak, because you can't face the idea of a purposeless existence, and so you go, well, I'm gonna pretend it's better. Let's play make-believe. It's better than forging my own meaning, and so yeah, God exists because I want him to. Part of the reason why some who don't believe will even express a longing to believe. I've heard that. Some of the people that I've had conversations with in my life have said flat out to me, I wish I believed. I wish I believed like you do. It would provide answers. It would provide meaning, but I just can't get there. Stephen Evans, in his wonderful little book, Why Believe, shares a story, leaning on his book for parts of this sermon, in fact. I would highly recommend it. But he was a young professor at the time and had connected with a student. He's a believer. The student was not. And he describes the student's sort of wistful envy at this professor who's got answers to questions that he wants to have. And he said, I wish I could believe what you believe, but I can't. I don't see it. And so Stephen Evanson was called into the dean's office after a winter break, and the dean informed him that the student had killed himself because of the lack of meaning in his life. He was actually surrounded by books of the occult where he was found having killed himself. And so Evans describes what I think a lot of us would feel at that time, which was a deep frustration with himself, going, is there more that I could have done? Could I have come into this student's life in a different way so that it didn't end this way? But he also expressed, where we're going to go this morning, he expressed frustration at a culture that makes faith so hard. And of course, college campus is maybe the hardest culture for faith at this point. So that's where we're going. Is it okay? Are there reasons where it would make sense for us to have faith? Should it be that hard for us to have faith or not? Now, look, we have all wondered. I'm not even going out on a limb there. You've wondered. I've wondered about these questions. We've all had questions about God's existence. Not even that. You probably still have questions about God's existence. I don't care how long you've been coming to this church. I know that because I still have questions about God's existence. If that doesn't ever happen to you, you're like asleep or something. I don't know what to tell you, okay? We have it. First of all, those questions are welcome here. That's important for us to say. This is not a place where people got it all figured out. This is a place for people who want to get it all figured out by turning to the book that we believe God wrote. But we'll come back to that in another week. More importantly for us this morning, these are questions that are welcome not just here, but that are welcome before God. God welcomes these questions. He can handle our questions. He is not angry or annoyed when people doubt his existence. In fact, he invites these sorts of questions. We're going to see it. So go ahead, turn with me, if you would, to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. If you're using the Pew Bible, the page number will be there in the bulletin, so you can get right there. We're going to look at just a couple of verses, what Paul says to this budding church in Rome on exactly this issue. So I'm going to look at Romans 1, just verses 19 and 20. Verse 19, by the way, picks up mid-sentence, so we're just going to start mid-sentence. Here we are, verse 19. What may be known about God is plain to them, and by them we mean all of humanity, really. So what may be known about God is plain to humanity, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, I love what Paul's doing here. I think this is brilliant. For reasons that we'll get to in 4 weeks, if you're still with us, we often spend our time in these services looking quite closely at the text. You'll hear me begin almost every sermon with the words, go ahead, grab your Bibles, open up to, and we're going to find our passage, and I'm going to walk through the text, because you did not come here to hear my thoughts, because I'm just not that smart, okay? I'm a finite being. You want advice from somebody better than me. So we look at what, again, we believe God has to say for us. We'll come back to whether or not this is what God actually has for us or not in, like I said, 4 weeks' time. But this morning we're going to do things a little bit differently here, because it's exactly what Paul tells us to do. So even just looking at this text, he says, maybe don't look at the text for a moment. He's almost saying, look, I know that some of you don't believe the Bible, which I could say too. I know that some of you don't believe the Bible. I get that. So tell you what, go outside and take a look around. Don't take my word for it. The evidence is there. Paul says, look at creation. Look at what has been made. Right? It's been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So look at creation. That's the universe. That's stars and galaxies. That's life, like plants and animals and things like that. And it's especially looking at humanity. We are a part of creation. We have been made. Our nature. You look there, you're going to see pointers to the existence of God aplenty. And we're going to look at just a few this morning. I've got kind of two big categories here. Pointers of the mind and pointers of the heart. We'll look at both. I'm going to be skimming across the surface. This is like skipping rocks, okay? We're not going too deep here. So if you got more questions, come talk to me, okay? We can have a longer conversation about any of these points. But for now, pointers of the mind. We really got to start at the beginning here when we have this conversation. Can we know anything? We're going to talk about pointers of the mind. Do our minds work? Can we know anything? Could we learn something like whether or not God actually exists? Now, if you are a bad skeptic, you will make a comment, something like, well, we can't know anything for sure. Here's why I say that's a bad skeptic, because if you can't know anything for sure, you can't know that you can't know anything for sure. So if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's false. It's one of those statements we don't need to pay any attention to at all. Now, here's the good news. Most people don't think that way. Most of us don't hold that sort of strong skepticism because we think there are ways to know things for sure, chiefly through science. So some sort of objective pursuit of knowledge, something like science. And so here's the way it would get expressed. Here's a guy like Bertrand Russell, famous atheist of the 20th century. He said this, what science cannot teach us, mankind cannot know. And I think what he means there is what science cannot teach us, mankind cannot know for sure. Like we're kind of guessing beyond that. Again, this is a bad statement. What science cannot teach us, mankind cannot know. Well, there is no scientific test to show you that what science cannot teach us, mankind cannot know, which means if that statement is true, it's false, and if it's false, it's false. Once again, it's completely false. It's self-defeating. We couldn't know that. But even when you just look at the scientific enterprise, you see this can't possibly be true. Because you need more than scientific knowledge, even just to do science. Look at all of these assumptions that are baked into the scientific enterprise. You need to believe in the laws of logic and mathematics, the reliability of your senses, and even certain moral intuitions, like you shouldn't falsify data. So all of that is in there. So now we got a whole lot more to work from in terms of how we can learn something. This is a massive challenge to the philosophy of relativism, which is so common today. The idea that there is no objective truth. Truth is relative. You'll hear it expressed. Somebody like Oprah has said it recently. That's your truth, as if it's a private possession and not something that exists externally, that it's objectively real, objectively true, and not just in the eye of a beholder, usually culture. So Greg Koukl, at one point I've shared this story before, Greg Koukl, who's a Christian apologist, founded Stand to Reason, wonderful organization, was debating an atheist philosopher named Marv Meyer on this debate topic: objective truth exists and can be known. And Koukl was arguing, yes, that's true, and Meyer was dissenting. And Koukl had a brilliant argument because he said, look, if Meyer shows up tonight, he loses. Like, if he comes here to make any arguments, to present any sort of case, what is he doing? He's saying, it is true that objective truth can't be known, and you can know that that's true. And so, if he wins, he loses. If you cast a vote for him, you're actually casting a vote for me. That's how debates work, and oddly enough, Koukl won quite handily. Go figure. This is also a challenge to religious relativism, because that's where I think it gets dicier for us. I think a lot of us would go, sure, there's some things that are true and that we can know, but there's some other things that maybe not. The metaphysical stuff, the supernatural stuff, that's where it gets tricky, but it's got that same crack running through it as we try and make sense of the world religions, which we will come back to in another sermon as well. Today, in our culture, we uphold values like enlightenment and tolerance, and we look down on things like narrow-mindedness and dogmatism. It gets expressed, the mere fact that we all know this parable shows how important this value is to our culture. The old Hindu parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant. And they're all grabbing different parts of the elephant, and they're like, an elephant is like a fan because they're grabbing its ear. It's like a hose because they're grabbing the trunk. It's like a wall as you're just pushing up against the side of the thing. And so that's our thinking when it comes to metaphysics. Maybe we each got just a little piece of it, and if we could all coexist, we got that bumper sticker and stuff, we would maybe get closer to the whole truth. There's such huge problems with this parable. The big one, of course, is that how do you know what's an elephant? Unless you are the sighted person who knows what they're all touching. So it's more dogmatic than any of those 6 guys talking about their take on the elephant. Okay? And it also breaks down anyway, because within these world religions, we don't have different pieces of the truth. Like an elephant could be like a fan and like a piece of rope at the same time. But we have contradictory statements. God cannot be both personal and impersonal simultaneously unless you want all of logic to break down. Like that denies the law of non-contradiction. If you take away the law of non-contradiction, you got nothing. You can make no more statements about anything, including that statement. So this is a problem. Plus, all that dogmatism still comes out. Here's John Hick, maybe the foremost defender of religious pluralism today, who wrote this: "It is arrogant to insist your religion is right and to convert others to it." And most people in our country today would go, yes, exactly. Here's the problem. Hick thinks he's right in his religious view, and he's trying to convince me that he's right about it too. In other words, he's trying to convert me. Do you see the problem that we start to have in all of this? I mean, by just the barest examination of how thought works, no evidence at this point beyond just looking for self-consistency in statements. That's all I've done so far. Like, let's just look at the statements themselves. We have already learned absolute truth must exist. We can know at least some of it, and some beliefs are wrong. No, that's not Christianity, right? We're not there yet. But hey, we're a lot closer than we were when we started 6 minutes ago. So we're making progress at least. Now let's take Paul's advice and let's look at the natural world for a moment. And the case for the existence of a creator, whatever that means, gets much, much stronger. So we're gonna take Plato's advice. We're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. What is the inference to the best explanation? We'll start with what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument. Word Kalam, by the way, you might look at it and go, that sounds like that's an Arabic word, because it is. It was developed by Muslim scholars back in right around 1000. So what we're talking about, we're not talking about the Christian God here. We're just talking about the existence of a God of some sort, a prime mover, a first cause. Here's the argument as it goes. Everything that begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe had a cause. And science confirms that this argument makes good sense. The universe had a beginning, based on all the available data today, known as the Big Bang, something like that. And the evidence is pretty clear, and it's getting harder and harder to deny. In fact, the best argument that the Big Bang supports theism, the idea that God exists, is the fact that atheists are so uncomfortable with it. You read atheistic scientists, and they'll make these comments all the time, like, I don't like this. People are going to think creation might be true if you keep looking at this. Exactly. That's the whole problem here. Many have tried to get around it. Stephen Hawking in his Brief History of Time, Steven Weinberg, others like that. Hawking relents. Near the end of his book, he goes, I'm just making this stuff up. Like, we're in imaginary time now, and that's probably not a good place to be for science. And so he says, we don't have any good answers. But where did the universe come from? Well, maybe it was just a fluctuation in a quantum vacuum. Or maybe it's not just our universe that exists, but the multiverse. There are literally an infinite number of universes, so of course one of them is going to look exactly like this one, which looks like it had a beginning and all of that. Here's the problem with this, is none of this actually answers the question. It just pushes the argument back a step. So fine, it's a fluctuation in a quantum vacuum. That's what led to this random occurrence. Why is there a quantum vacuum? Why are there laws governing a quantum vacuum? Or why is there a multiverse? And you still got to explain the existence of all of them. Never mind the fact that there is zero evidence for any universe other than ours. How is this more ludicrous than my faith in God? Right? This is the blindest faith of the worst believer on the planet at this point. That's the realm that we're in. There is no evidence whatsoever. Now, Paul Davies, a physicist, says it like this, that the idea that maybe the laws themselves cause the universe to come into being. He says, I've never liked the idea of divine tinkering. For me, it is much more inspiring to believe, interesting phrasing, that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into being. This is Plato's view as well, by the way. There's a problem with that, and C.S. Lewis said it some 60 years ago. Thinking that laws can produce the things they govern is a little bit like thinking you can create real money by doing sums. Would be nice. It just doesn't work that way. It's not just the existence of the universe, though, that can't be explained. It's also the type of universe that we have, the intricate fine-tuning of the universe, which is remarkable. Hugh Ross details at least 32 different laws that need to be incredibly precise in order for the universe to have the possibility of life. I'm not going to go through all 32. Let me just go through one to show you how precise this universe actually is. That's the amount of entropy needed at the beginning of the universe, at its inception, so that the second law of thermodynamics could work. Second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which means chaos, is increasing, which means you need to have a universe that starts with low entropy. So how hard is that to get? And he says, picture a creator aiming at the phase space of the universe with a pin. How precisely do you need to get that pin in order to create this sort of universe where that law would work out? How accurate must that placement be? They've done studies. It is 1 times 1 part in 10 to the 123rd power. And you're all like, I don't remember math. I'm sorry. We don't use it on a day-to-day basis. I don't know this anymore. So that's 1 followed by 10 to the 123rd zeros. And you're like, you've lost me again. How big a number is that? It is such a big number that if we had an infinite number of people, an infinite number of pens and all that, we still couldn't write this number out, because if we wrote a 0 on every single particle in the universe, we would run out of space. A degree of precision, let's just say it that way. 1 out of the 32 that Hugh Ross talks about. Paul Davies, the same guy who said it'd be inspiring to believe laws created all this, said the evidence of design is overwhelming. And what's our mantra? Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Well, the evidence is design. What's the inference? The best explanation that the universe was designed, created. And it's not just the existence of the universe and the precision of that universe that exists, but the existence of life as well. Life is so complex. The specified complexity, that is the specific information that is coded in DNA is so, let me put it this way, my wife's laughing at me, this is horrible. I'm going to sit down, I don't know what to do now. The chasm between the most complicated non-living object, like a crystal or a snowflake, and the most basic living cell, the single cell, is a chasm so vast it's almost infinite. And the origin of that information is simply impossible to account for. A random development cannot possibly explain it. I've done this one before too, but I love it. We always talk about if you had an infinite number of monkeys and gave them enough time, they would type the works of Shakespeare, like they could type Hamlet. So let's do that. One monkey, one key, 1 second would take just under 35 hours for that monkey to type the word "the" randomly. Let's get a little bit more complicated. Let's do Psalm 23, one of the shorter psalms, but it's 603 letters. It would take that one monkey, one key, 1 second. How many hours? 10 to the 1017th power, which you're like, that seems big. Yeah, the universe is 10 to the 11th hours long, if we go with when science points to 15 billion years old, that kind of thing. So yeah, we don't have quite enough time for Psalm 23, and DNA is a bit more complicated than Psalm 23. So here's a couple of astrophysicists, their summary of it. No matter how large the environment one considers, life cannot have had a random beginning. Troops of monkeys thundering away at random on typewriters could not produce the works of Shakespeare, for the practical reason that the whole observable universe is not large enough to contain the necessary monkey hordes, the necessary typewriters, and certainly not the waste paper baskets required for the deposition of wrong attempts. The same is true for living material. The likelihood of the spontaneous formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 zeros after it. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must have been the product of purposeful intelligence. In sum, we're trying to put all these arguments, life is a complex database of digital information. The only source for any equivalent in complexity in information is intelligent design, like humans creating literature, for example, and chance and necessity are simply incapable of producing that sort of information. Let's flip. Pointers of the heart. Pointers of the heart. Here's where we're going. Immanuel Kant, the theologian, philosopher of a few centuries back, said, "Two things fill my mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." And these are our two main points. We just looked at the starry heavens. Let's look at the moral law within us. There are aspects of the human existence, truth, beauty, goodness, that require a transcendent ground, something supernatural. So what Kant called the moral law, it certainly seems to exist. And not only that, we all acknowledge it. This is exactly what Paul tells us. So if you're in Romans 1, just look over at Romans 2. Here's Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. A little parenthetical remark that Paul has. He writes, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law," that is because they weren't Jews, they don't have the Old Testament. "When Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them." He's saying, we know it's there. We all know it's there. And I think we could say these three fairly non-contentious statements. A moral standard exists. We might quibble about certain aspects of it, but some sort of moral standard exists. We break it regularly, but that doesn't diminish its sense of reality, because we feel a certain sense of guilt when we transgress the moral law. Easier to see, though, in that we feel a sense of outrage when other people transgress the law, especially against us. Might not pick up on my selfishness. I certainly pick up on the selfishness of everyone around me. So it's far easier to see it in others. But the fact that we transgress this law that's written on our hearts doesn't change the fact that it's there. Here's what some people will deny it philosophically. They'll make the argument on college campuses and elsewhere that no absolute standard of morality exists. And when somebody does that, you steal their iPhone. See how they feel about the moral law then. Because they're going to go, hey, you can't do that. That's mine. There's a moral law in place. No one is really a moral relativist. I've never met somebody who actually thinks this is true. So they can pontificate about the fact that this moral law that Christians or others promote is sexually regressive or something like that, and maybe it is, but they still don't want the world to look like Handmaid's Tale. They think that would be bad, that it would be against their moral law. People might have an issue with world missions and Christians going and trying to convert tribes, for example, to the Christian message, but they would probably see that as a little bit less evil than going there with an M60 and wiping out the tribe. which we would know is wrong. That's a bad choice. Or even this. Here's my favorite example of how we know the moral law exists. You have people often say to you who don't believe in a moral law, you shouldn't impose your views on others. So you're telling me that I shouldn't impose, your view is that, okay, that you're trying to impose on, I just want to be clear on that. We have this sense of you ought not to have done that. But what explains that sense of ought or ought not? There are things we know shouldn't be done. Children should not be abused. People should not be murdered because you don't like the color of their skin. It's wrong to hatch a Ponzi scheme to hoodwink people out of their hard-earned money. But why? That's the question. Why is it wrong? Now, for now, we're going to push the question of why a God, whatever this God is, might allow evil in the world. That's next week's question, by the way. So we're coming back to that. Push that to the side for the moment. When you feel that sense of how could God allow something like this, the question is it evil? Aren't you acknowledging that this is evil? This sort of tragedy should not have happened. The Holocaust should not have happened because it is evil. So how could God allow it? Again, we'll get there next week. But for now, we're admitting that it was bad. And that's important. What makes you say that? On what ground can you say this was wrong? Does it merely come from culture? I don't think so. I don't think that explains it, because then you couldn't arbitrate between cultures. Give you the extreme example. I didn't like Nazi culture, but who am I to say that their culture was wrong? No one thinks that way. I mean, that's just absurd. What about slavery? I mean, slavery is practiced in parts of the Middle East still today. Are we comfortable saying, well, it's not my thing, but, that's their culture? The subjugation of women, which happens the world over. That's cool. When we don't do it here, we're kind of pro-women, Me Too movement, and all that stuff. But over there, it's fine. We don't think this way. So then, where does this sense of ought come from if it doesn't come from culture? Is it an evolutionary development? Perhaps to help us function as sort of a society, we better chance of surviving if we function as a tribe. Well, that might explain the origin of these feelings, but it is not a ground for those feelings. By the way, even an atheist as noted as Steven Pinker would say, sure, maybe there's some evolutionary evidence of that. There's plenty of evolutionary evidence against that also, so it's not clear-cut anyway. But the problem with that is it ends up explaining morality away. There's no real reason for it. So it helped us to survive if we came together as a tribe. But if immorality today makes it more likely that I survive and my progeny, am I then justified, whatever that word means, it doesn't have any meaning anymore, would I be justified in pursuing immorality and wiping out somebody so that I can take their resources or something? Or is it just a social contract? This was the argument of Thomas Hobbes and others. Now, here's Hobbes' argument. We all need help at times. And if we're willing to help others, they'll be more likely to help us. The problem with this one, of course, is that it then means morality rests on self-interest, which, by the way, some would argue, myself included, that self-interest is at the root of all immorality. It's our selfishness that leads us to pursue evil choices. So putting us back on selfishness seems like a dangerous place to me. And then as soon as that self-interest is better served by immorality, there will no longer be any constraints. Give you the example that many have done in combating Hobbes. It would be better for us if our doctors didn't cheat on their medical exams so that they, diagnose us effectively and all that. But it might be better for me if I cheat on my medical exams in order to pursue my lifelong dream of being a doctor. And so what do you end up with? You end up in a do unto others before they do unto you morality. Pervasive in our culture, but hardly adequate for a moral law. You see what the problem is. Inevitably, attempts to create morality, a standard of morality, apart from some absolute external standard, fail. Because there's no ground, no agreement for how to define that morality. Jerry Coyne, author of the book Why Evolution is True, and he's not just talking about the origin of species, but the origin of life, the origin of the universe. There is no God. That's his view. He says he can justify his moral choices on several grounds. It leads to more harmonious society. It helps other people. And frankly, it gets you a little more respect if you treat people well. These are the sorts of arguments that will be trotted out, by the way. Some of you may be going, yes, that's exactly what I think. Right. I like this guy. I'm going to read his book now. The problem with his answer is that it involves circular reasoning primarily, because we're trying to figure out what good and evil are. So to say it creates a more harmonious society, why is that good? Well, it's good because it creates harmony. Well, why do we want harmony? Because it's good. Well, what makes it good? Because it creates harmony. It's circular logic. You see, same thing with helping others. Why do we help others? Because it's good. Why do you know it's good? Because it helps others. So circular logic, not a good way to argue. Okay? You're not winning the argument when you do this. You're spinning your wheels. That's what you're doing there. And then the whole idea of respect is going to fail as well. We're back in self-interest, which has its issues. Plus, let's face it, you're only going to get respect if it comes at a low cost to you. You're not going to risk you and your family being sent to the concentration camps as you aid Jews trying to flee the Holocaust because your neighbors might respect you. It's just not enough. So we have issues. Or we can all affirm justice. That's a pretty spectacular buzzword for us today. In fact, we just finished a series on justice not that long ago. I'm for justice. But whose justice? Where's the standard for justice? In several countries in the world, you can be executed for converting to anything other than Islam. Is that just? It is, in some people's eyes. Do we have anything we can say against that? Or maybe we go with the notion of harm. So long as it doesn't hurt other people, it's good. This is very popular in our culture. It's why the word consensual is the only word that matters in our sexual ethic today. But how do you define harm? You have to have a notion of good and evil baked into it already. Is what I do in the privacy of my own room, that's between me and no one else. So pornography is probably fine then, right? Except that it creates a culture in which violence against women is much more common. It leads to human trafficking. It warps your own mind so that you're incapable of loving other people. Does that qualify as harm or not? You see how we're going to have to keep pushing it back until we need a standard at some point. Or the issue we discussed just a few weeks back. Which causes more? Which harm matters more? The harm that would cause a pregnant mother to carry her pregnancy to term, even though she didn't want the child? Or the harm done to the child in the womb? By the way, did you notice that all of our political disagreements are competing goods? This would help us in our civility, in our discourse. If we recognize the problem is we both want good things and we're not sure we can have both of them at the same time, which one goes first? That's the question we keep debating, and that's going to require some sort of standard. Well, even that one, we're talking about the right to life versus the right to choose. So let's talk rights then. Everyone loves human rights. Part of our moral fabric is the sense of humanity's worth, our dignity, our value, and even human rights. But again, where do they come from? What is the ground for human rights? If we're not made in the image of some god or other, do we have value? If I'm just time plus matter plus chance, if this is just survival of the fittest, then there can be no possibility of human rights. It's a meaningless concept, which is why some of our favorite civil rights speakers, guys like Martin Luther King Jr., didn't argue that way. Listen to MLK. We must never forget this as a nation. There are no gradations in the image of God. Every man, from a treble white to a bass black, is significant on God's keyboard precisely because every man is made in the image of God. That's where our value and dignity would come from. Now, the moral law, I've spent a lot of time on, is a key piece of this discussion. But there are many other pointers of the heart that we could talk about. Love and beauty and purpose. Let's hit them just briefly. When I mention love, I'm not talking about the moral obligation to love. That would still be the moral law. Even then, though, that is interesting. That's something we've lost today. You look at even Supreme Court decisions about marriage recently, and they put it on the sense of your own self-fulfillment. So right now, we get married in order to bring ourselves the happiness we want. That's the opposite of love. So our basis for marriage is no longer love. So we should probably be talking about the moral obligation to love more than we do. Not what I'm talking about here, though. Here I'm talking about the feeling of love that I have towards my wife, towards my children. Is that just DNA? Is that just neurons firing in my brain or not? So Dr. Budziszewski, who's an ethicist down in Texas, was an atheist for a long while. He talked about this because he was a consistent atheist in his thinking, which is difficult to do. And so he said this is what happened. He knew he loved his wife and kids, but he regarded that love as subjective preference rather than objective reality. So he was a physical determinist, which is the most logical thing to be if you deny the existence of God, which means we are just DNA. We have no free will. This is just what happens, how our brains develop kind of thing. And he says, think what this did to my very capacity to love them. After all, love is a commitment of the will to the true good of another person. And how can one's will be committed to the true good of another person if he denies the reality of good, denies the reality of persons, and denies that his commitments are in his control? Love is undone if we strip God out of the equation. Now, you may tell me, fine, no one really thinks that way. Other than on college campuses where they're indoctrinating kids, which is probably why we've got some of the chaos we've got in our world today. But no one really thinks that way. Are you sure? So here's the Telegraph, one of the most renowned newspapers in the world, London Telegraph. It said just a few years back, a scientific account of mankind has no more place for free will or the equal capacity of each individual to be good and act justly than it has for the soul. You strip the immortality out of the equation. You strip God's existence out of the equation, and you're left with no free will, and that you might not have the capacity to do good or act justly, which is fine because those words don't mean anything anyway. Or Richard Dawkins, everyone's favorite atheist, in that he is a walking straw man for the atheist argument. He says this: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Isn't that a shocking statement? There's no evil and no good. All those things you read about in the news that you think that's awful, that should never have happened. No, it should have happened, because that's where DNA led us, and we just do what DNA tells us to do. We have no control over our purposeless lives. Now, C.S. Lewis, again writing some 60 years before Dawkins, already batted Dawkins' argument away. Dawkins must not have read him. He says this: you can't, except in the lowest animal sense, be in love with a girl if you know that all the beauties both of her person and of her character are a momentary and accidental pattern produced by the collision of atoms, and that your own response to them is only a sort of psychic phosphorescence arising from the behavior of your genes. You can't go on getting very serious pleasure from music if you know and remember that its air of significance is a pure illusion, that you like it only because your nervous system is irrationally conditioned to like it. Now, if we don't live like that's true, and we certainly don't live like that's true, none of us, that's probably because it isn't true. And we already saw some of the issues with the idea that the scientific account makes sense of our being here. But Lewis also raises the issue of beauty for us in that quote. Do you understand that if we're just time plus matter plus chance, it is irrational to be moved by beauty? We have no explanation for it. Like, look, you let your dog outside, say around 5 o'clock today at this time of year. Your dog, he goes skipping outside. Has your dog ever stopped, entranced, as it looks toward the southwest and sees the breathtaking wonder of a sky dappled with blue and pink and orange and purple, with tears forming in his eyes at the beauty of it all? No, your dog doesn't do that, but you do. Where does that come from? These are questions we cannot ask. Leonard Bernstein, again, not exactly an evangelical Christian. He was speaking of Beethoven. He said Beethoven wrote pieces of breathtaking rightness. Rightness, that's the word. That's the exact quote. It's right what Beethoven wrote. Beauty makes sense to us. Where does that come from? And even purpose, the issue we discussed at length last week. We feel like our lives have significance, that our lives are not just a stage littered with junk on which the curtain rises for a few minutes and then falls again. But you strip God out of the equation and it's not true. You can build into people, you can do good, they still die, everybody else dies, the sun burns out, and what did any of it matter? This is the whole point of The Time Machine, H.G. Wells' short story. Like the protagonist, he eventually goes to the end of time in his little time machine, and there's nothing there. It's oblivion. And what does he do? He goes back and lives the rest of his life. How could you live the rest of your life knowing none of it mattered? But that's exactly where we would be. Or the other possibility, we could be immortal, and God could exist. Maybe it's not the God of the Bible. We're not there, not yet at least, but something or someone behind it all that makes sense of all the things I've talked about this morning. Well, just look quickly with me at verse 18, if you would. I started mid-sentence. Let's do the whole sentence. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since it's clear that God exists. Verses 19 and 20. If God exists, if God created us, then we are his. We belong to him. And denying him by suppressing the truth would be, well, let's use an archaic word, sin. It would be sin. It would be rebellion. It would be wrong. It would be evil. And just then we begin to see why maybe we might need someone like Jesus, who is fully God and fully human, to pay the penalty for our sin. Human so that he could pay humanity's penalty. Divine so that he could pay an infinite penalty. All of a sudden we start to see why maybe we are going to have to start to look at the God of the Bible specifically. It's actually interesting. If you just flip back up to verse 16 so quickly, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Same word power that he talks about in verse 20. His eternal power is on display for us to see. The power in creation, but the power and the majesty of the gospel message as well. That's where we're headed, but we're not there yet. We've got a few more weeks to go. I've just given a number of very strong arguments for the existence of God, but before we get any further, we've got to stop and consider the most important argument against the existence of God, which is the presence of so much suffering and pain. We can't call it evil if God doesn't exist, but suffering and pain in the world. That's what we'll consider next week. We'd certainly invite you back to that, but let's pray now. Lord, God, if you are there, if you exist, if these pointers that we see in creation, in the starry heavens above, in the moral law written on our hearts, in our appreciation of beauty, in our sense of goodness, in the complexity of life, in our sense that humans have value and dignity and should be accorded rights, if all of these pointers are true, and you do exist, would you reveal yourself to us? Would you help us, each one of us in this room, to know on a deeper level than what mere scientific knowledge could give us, that you are there and that we belong to you? We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.